Hello, everyone. I am going live a little early tonight, but I have a guest coming on, Wally Kern. He's a gecko breeder. He does isopods. He does all kinds of fun stuff. So we're going to get him on here in a little bit. And we'll see how this goes. But as for right now, it's just me for a few minutes until Wally Kern is ready to go. So that's what we're going to do. Oh, Justin, I am sorry about your uncle, Justin. It's great to see you here. Dale, nice to see you. Tanisha, it's nice to see you. How are all you guys doing? How is Tanisha doing? How is Dale doing? How is Justin doing? But when Wally Kern comes in, we'll get him on here. If you have any questions about your isopods or geckos or anything like that, he is the man to ask. He is very good at what he does. So if you guys want to take a minute and share this, would be great. I would appreciate it. I'm going to go let people know that I'm live myself right now. It's just going to be a fun night, I think. So I hope everybody's doing good. Let me see here. Gray's Reptiles, how are you? What's David Theory? How are you, my friend? Been a while since you've been on. You've been pretty busy with work and everything, huh? And the kids. And anyway, Wally Kern will be on. He's a gecko guy, and he does all kinds of geckos. You name the gecko, he's pretty much had it or has bred it of some sort, and he knows his stuff. Very, very knowledgeable individual. I hope you guys know who Wally Kern is. Most of you should. I am inviting people right now as we speak over to the live stream that I may have that I don't want to miss out on this. Please take a moment to share this so everybody knows. That's good, Gray's Reptiles. That's good. Yes, we're all doing fine here so far. The whole COVID-19 is really low in our state. That don't mean we're safe, but it just means that we're low at the moment. And we do self-isolation. I have a mask when I go out. My whole family wears a mask when we go out. We're constantly washing and prelling our hands. The things that they've asked us to do, that's pretty much what we're doing. Just to, make sure we're all safe and stuff. It's just good to be that way, Juan, how are you? Yeah, we're doing our best. That's all you can do, you do have to go out at some points. You do have to go to the stores and things like that. It's just a must. So you have to survive. Did it? Yeah, we had there's a lady in town here as a seamstress. She made ours. I don't know where mine's at the moment. It's out in the other room. As a matter of fact, I'm not going to go get it right now. But it's pretty. It's really interesting. It's a really good mask. Congratulations, Juan. How did it fail you? Did you sew one or what did you do, Tanisha? Yeah, that's Becky says the same thing. They cut her hours back and all, but still gotta gotta trump forward. You gotta keep moving forward. Rose, how are you doing? Very nice one. Oh, a bandana mask. Yeah. You might want to get a winter scarf and just wrap it around your head, you know, from there down. That might work. Well, that's a good job. That's what Becky's doing too. She's kind of handing food out to people, and it's only for so much time a day. It's not really long, so it's not like she's getting full pay or nothing like that. So it's hurting, but we're hanging in there. Got to do what you got to do. So Wally Kern said he'll be here, in about 10 minutes or so. So we'll see. I sent him the link, and we'll see if he's um able to hop on or not. I am sure he will be able to. So it will be quite fun to have him on here. Let me see here. So, Rose, how are things going with you with the new iguana and stuff like that? Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's kind of um it's kind of lasting a long time. I understand what you're saying there, Dale. No, Gray, I happen to uh, sell all my discus. Um, they end up being a lot of work. I don't know, if um, if you've had discus before, but it ends up being a lot of work. But I believe we got Wally Kern here. Let me see if I can get him in here. Um, we'll see if he comes. Oh, wait, we're going to see. Might take a minute or so. We'll see what happens. So we are going to see. Anyway, I'll take this off until he gets in here. It's he entered the link. He's doing something. So when he's ready, we'll get him up. What the hell? What's what exactly is it you do for um a job there, David? Yeah, it's a lot of work sometimes there to calm one of them guys down. I had a big one once that was somebody had given me because it was just crazy. Monk, how are you doing? At least I'm hoping Wally can hop in. I don't know. It went off now, so we're gonna see what happens here. See if he can get in here or not. He should be able to enter it though. It's pretty simple, unless of course he's got something wrong with his equipment, which is possible. Which is very, very possible. Um, there he is. There he is. All right. Can you hear me, Wally?
I can hear you, Andrew. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine.
Excellent.
So, everybody, Wally Kern. He breeds geckos and isopods and all kinds of fun stuff over there at the Kern residence.
Three young boys.
Kids. Yeah, he's done the kid round. Now he's always got, I believe it's your granddaughter that's in your videos a lot.
Now we have our granddaughter.
Yeah, very, very good. Does anybody have any questions for him before we get going? Because I was just going to talk to you about like geckos and your isopods and things like that, and where you see the future of your hobby going, where you want it to go, where you want to take it to. So, can you see the comments or no?
I can't. I can jump over to YouTube and see if I can grab them from there.
Everybody's saying, "Hey, Wally." They love the mustache.
Hi, everybody.
What kind of guy? He does all kinds of geckos. He does. I believe. I don't know if you have leopard geckos no more, but I know you got crested geckos, morning geckos.
Oh, I have crested geckos, leopard geckos, exotic geckos, micro geckos. I think we have probably right now about 50 different species of geckos. Kind of gets crazy at times.
It does, but you have a passion for it and you love it, so that's what makes it fun.
It does make it fun.
And how many different species of isopods do you have?
We have 50 different species of isopods. And that sounds crazy, doesn't it?
It does, because it starts off with just one or two, and then the next thing you know, you got tons.
I started keeping isopods probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And I kept them just for, like most people, as a bioactive cleanup crew. So I kept 2 or 3 different types. And then I've mentioned to you, Andrew, and maybe other people know this. I got out of the hobby about 4 years ago. For a couple of years, I had a big project at work, and it just consumed all of my time. And my wife took care of all of the animals downstairs. The isopods, unfortunately, didn't make it, but they were just dwarf whites and very common isopods. Then being out of the hobby, I got back into the hobby, and just like you had mentioned before, I had to find the geckos and the animals that I really had a passion with keeping. And I went out and got 4 or 5 geckos that I really, really loved, other than my crested geckos and gargoyles and leopard geckos. But I also got back into isopods because I had so much fun with them. And the funny thing is that at that time, it was in the fall, late summer, early fall, that I got back into the hobby. But I kept isopods. And at that time, geckos really start broodmating. and start not breeding for the long winter. And the isopods kind of kept me going so that I had at least something breeding, something that I could walk downstairs and open the top of a tub and see babies. So it really kept me going that way.
Well, that's good. That's good. Um, do you have any tips for anybody who wanted to get into isopods or anything like that? Because I know sometimes if you don't keep the proper the proper setup, a colony can die pretty easy. They can die really easy.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate. But there's just a couple of different tips that are really important with isopods, and I love to keep them. There's a couple of different reasons for keeping isopods, and obviously one is as a cleanup crew. Another is as potentially a feeder. I don't know, Andrew, if you've tried feeding your isopods to any of your tarantulas.
No, you ask me that a lot, and I just don't have the little heart to drop them in there.
I've gotten to the point where I have a couple of isopods that are really, really multiplying quickly, powder blues and some others, and I've tried feeding them to the geckos, and the geckos take them fairly regularly. But that's another reason to keep isopods. Another reason is I kind of look at it kind of like collecting Beanie Babies or baseball cards or something like that. I have 50 different species and they're all a little bit different, and it's more like a collection at this point. Some of them are, can go out to the yard and pick up isopods, roly-polies, pill bugs, but some are very exotic, hard to keep, very expensive. Maybe some of the folks in the chat know what a rubber ducky isopod is.
I know what it is.
Yeah. I think when I got back into the hobby and started looking at isopods, rubber duckies were going for about $30 a piece. So if you're looking at, getting a culture of 10, you can drop some pretty significant money on a small group of isopods. And then again, cross your fingers that they live. But some of the mainstays of the hobby, like dairy cows and powder blues and some of the others like that, really have a couple of requirements. They need a hiding place. They need a moist spot somewhere in the enclosure. And I use, 6-quart and 9-quart and 15-quart tubs. They need a moist spot, so I use sphagnum moss and I keep the sphagnum moss moist, and that seems to be enough for them. And they need leaves and they need decaying wood. The better you can have, decaying leaves or decaying wood, that's what they eat in nature. And then you can supplement their diet with, all kinds of other foods, just about anything really. And that's about it. So moisture, decaying leaves, and a hiding spot. And that's pretty much it. Room temperature,
yep,
and you're good to go.
But if they overpopulate and you don't separate them down, they could die from that too, right?
They absolutely can. I had a culture of convexus, the curly isopods that kind of really, I had them in a 27-quart, which is a pretty big enclosure. And I would have to say there were probably 5,000 in there.
Oh.
And yeah, it was a huge culture. And, I would pick up a log, a piece of cork bark or whatever, and they were just running like, if you've ever seen, the roaches, a bad commercial on roaches where they're just running all over the place. That's what these isopods look like. But so they were doing really well, but they started kicking back, and I got down to about 1,000 or 2,000. So what I do now is, especially with them, they're more of a soft body isopod. I will take those and feed them to the geckos.
All right. Now springtails, do you raise them too, or do you just let them go in with the?
I'm a huge fan of springtails. So I raise springtails on the side, and I also have springtails in probably just about every one of my isopod cultures. Isopods are a cleanup crew. That means that they eat any kind of, again, decaying leaves and wood or food that you put in there, anything that starts that decaying process. But if you feed too much, then the isopods help to clean up what the cleanup crew don't clean up.
Michigan Exotics Juan asked, have you ever kept pill millipedes? And if so, have you ever been successful with them?
I did. I had a vendor down in Chicago that does isopods, give me some pill millipedes. I think there were 4 or 5 in the container, and they did great for about 5 or 6 months. But unfortunately, and I had the container. I actually have the container right here by my desk. It dried out a little bit, and I think that I lost them because it dried out. Unfortunately, it's a culture that pill millipedes pretty much eat just decaying wood and decaying leaves, so they're almost maintenance free. Other than you have to keep them a little bit moist, and unfortunately, I let them get a little bit too dry.
Um,
Beautiful animals, all.
any other invertebrates and stuff that you keep there?
I do. So and Andrew, you really know this. I have a huge, huge fear of spiders.
Yes.
So I'll never be able to keep spiders. I have, a fascination with the spiders, especially like jumping spiders or especially tarantulas. Anything that's, maybe a little slower moving. Any fast spiders I really have a problem with. So while I have that fascination, I probably will never keep tarantulas, simply because if they do get out, I don't know if I can handle that. I recently, and again, this, I was able to kind of conquer the fears a little bit and held a tarantula, which goes against every grain of my being. It gave me chills up and down my arms, and I almost passed out. It was just such a weird experience, but I held it. But that doesn't mean that I would feel safe having one in the house, simply because, again, if it got out, I don't know if I could control it and get it back in correctly into a container.
Tarantulas, I've got them, but I do hear your fear of that because they are very fast. I swear, if one got out, my wife would make me throw some bug bombs in the basement and bomb the whole basement out, because she would panic if one got out.
I think spiders, I'm okay as long as I know where it is. If it knows where I'm at and I know where it's at, we're both good. But if I turn my back for a second and it's not in that same spot, the goosebumps and the terror starts developing. So, invertebrates, I wouldn't keep spiders, but, keeping the isopods I got into also around the same time, not much after that, I started keeping millipedes. So, there's a big difference between millipedes and centipedes. Centipedes are venomous to a degree. Millipedes can be a little toxic too. You have to wash your hands after handling them, but centipedes can be, venomous. So I don't keep the centipedes here, again, just in case when we get out and with our granddaughter in the house. I wouldn't feel comfortable with that. But the millipedes are just perfect. And the fun thing about them is that they reproduce, fairly easily. So, opening the container and seeing the adult millipedes in the container, and then seeing just a swarm of these little tiny stick things, and you see them moving, it's just such a cool experience. And it's interesting because our granddaughter, again, she's 8 years old now, but a couple of years ago when I started keeping all these, it was Grandpa's isopods, but it was her dairy cow isopods. So she adopted our dairy cows. They belonged to her. They didn't belong to Grandpa. But these millipedes, she'll handle the millipedes, not a fear in the world. And I think that that's what, we as adults, we need to get the kids understanding, right away. You shouldn't have a fear about animals. You should have a respect for animals, especially something like a centipede or tarantula, but you shouldn't have a fear of them. And I think that's, where I, went wrong as a kid. I'll tell the story real quick. Used to play ball and tag and in empty lots, and I ran through tall grass once, and I ran through a web, and I looked down and there was a big spider on my chest. This is like when I was 7 years old, and I think from that point on, I really had that fear built up in me. So it took 60 years for me to overcome that fear, but at least I got to that point.
Yeah. You talk about millipedes being slightly toxic, like from what they secrete. I know in Madagascar they get them giant millipedes over there, and lemurs will lick them and get high. and fall out of
Is
trees and
that
stuff.
right?
And they do that. They look for them to deliberately do it. They did this whole survey on them and realized that they actually seek them out, just like a person who's addicted to drugs will seek out drugs. Same thing. They will seek them out just to get high off them.
Maybe lemurs go off to work and they have a bad day. They come home and they look a millipede.
Yeah.
I wonder if it has any weird effects on them. Is it a stimulant? It'd be interesting to follow that up and
you wonder if it's like a psychedelic or something, who knows? So do you breed your own food too? You like your own crickets or roaches or anything like that?
Yes, absolutely. So, I've been in the hobby for probably about 20 years, and I started breeding millipedes and dubias almost right away, just something to ease, the cost of buying food so much. At one point, we were going through, I think this was back in the early 2000s, we were buying, around $5,000 to $6,000 a year on food. We were going through that much food. So I realized, you look for ways to improve, with Supreme Gecko, it's all about education. It's all about teaching other people. It's all about sharing the information. But it also is a business as well. And, I want to look at it with, both sides of the hat going. But, since it is a business, I look for ways to improve, profits, ways to sell more, but also ways to cut costs, and that's a huge area where I realized at one point, I have to cut the costs. I can't afford to spend $6,000 a year on feeder insects, especially crickets. In the middle of the winter, you get an order of crickets in, and they come in and they're all dead, and it's cricket soup. It's just the worst experience. So we started breeding dubias, and it cut our cost into a quarter, almost instantly. So we're breeding, and I've taken that, there's only certain dubias, though, are roaches that I breed. I breed dubias, and I think it's called Schwarzei, a really small roach, but that's the only two roaches that I breed. I don't breed the lobsters because I'm just afraid of them, getting out into the house. In fact, I bred lobster roaches a long time ago when my wife had, we actually split up the daycare room downstairs. She had half of it for the basement we split up. She had half of it for the daycare, and I had half of it for the geckos. I've since overtaken the whole room, the whole basement for my geckos. But at that point, I was afraid of the roaches getting out, and one kid seeing a roach, it would kind of not be a good thing. There was a point where I went into one of my day gecko tanks to clean it, and I pulled out some of the other, cork bark and everything. I pulled the plant out and I put it on my cart and went to get something else in the tank, and then turned to look at the cart, and here on the plant, the roaches were coming out of the plant like rats from a sinking ship. It was just amazing. And, I killed as many as I could, obviously, and none got past, my little area. But at that point, I took all my lobster roaches, which was probably about 120 quart bin, and I put them outside in the middle of winter, and they froze up. But I just realized I can't have these getting out. So I'm very careful with the dubias. But dubias, if are fairly slow. So we don't have dubias out at all. I'm very, very careful with them, and I have dishes in all of my tanks so that they generally can't get out of the dishes. So they're very much contained. But I'm breeding dubias. I have 4 big bins of dubias, and I have probably 5 or 6 bins of mealworms. And the good thing about, breeding your own insects, especially at this time, is you don't have to rely on, man, if I don't get those insects in, tomorrow, I don't have food for my animals.
Yeah.
I still order some, insects. I got an order of crickets a couple of days ago. But it's not like, my gosh, if I don't get them, my animals won't have anything to eat for a week. And I
Yeah.
know that lately, there's been a lot of problems with getting insects in, and I just spoke to somebody that said they're on a 12-day waiting list for mealworms.
Wow.
So
Oh,
yeah, yeah,
I know. Doobie roaches, if they were to get out and it wasn't the right temperature, they wouldn't breed. So that would probably be one good thing. If a do,
exactly.
but I know like the little red runners and the
Yeah,
lobster roaches, I, I wouldn't even want to bring one of them into my house for fear it would
I
get
know.
out. I could just see it. If they got out, you could run into trouble.
So when we had the lobster roaches, in the house, and I told that story with the plant and them getting out. I wasn't so much worried about them getting out. I was more worried about my wife seeing one and what she would do to me, and
Yeah, it could end your hobby pretty quick.
it would end my hobby just like that.
um, Now with crickets, what do you do? Like I know a lot of people complain about the smell of crickets. And what do you do for the smell of crickets? And I heard now I know this is true, but I don't know how many crickets you feed. But the exoskeleton has that protein in it that's not good for certain animals if you feed them a lot of it. So what do you do to keep the smell down and stuff like that?
Well, I'm lucky enough, and for crickets, we're feeding many different types of geckos here. I pretty much just keep geckos. I don't keep other animals. I used to keep a lot of chameleons, but we've gotten away from that. But for the geckos, crickets aren't their main food source. So, especially for crusted geckos and gargoyle geckos, I'm feeding the Pangea crusted gecko diet, and that works out really well. So crickets and insects are a supplement to their stable staple diet of the crusted gecko diet. So I don't worry too much about adding too much with the crickets because they're also getting dubias and they're getting mealworms, especially all the other geckos, the leopard geckos and some of the Australian geckos. They get mostly mealworms and mostly dubious. I'm never really concerned about, a lot of people are concerned about the exoskeleton on mealworms as well. My feeling is that these animals in nature aren't looking at an insect and going, oh my gosh, that exoskeleton, if I eat too much, they're, if they see a beetle, they're grabbing that beetle and they're eating it. If they can't take it in, if they can't eat it, if they, know that they can't adjust it, they spit it out.
Mm-hmm.
So I never have really a fear of feeding too much mealworms or too much crickets. I try to vary the diets as much as I possibly can. We have the dubias, we have the mealworms. I also, feed a lot of fruit flies, a lot of peanut beetle larvae, flower beetles. I'm feeding a lot of different foods down there just to give them a balance. But I also say, with that, somebody's going to think, well, maybe the balanced diet is a requirement, and I like it personally because I enjoy them eating different foods, but absolutely you have to do the supplementation if you're feeding your animals live foods. You have to give the calcium and the multivitamin as well as a
Yeah.
dusting.
Mm-hmm. Now with your geckos, I see you got a lot of geckos. What is your favorite gecko, and where do you see your gecko hobby itself? What you're doing going? Like, what's your ultimate goal to get to with your geckos?
What a great question. um, I mentioned before, when I got out of the hobby and got back into it, I achieved my goal almost immediately, and that was to work with the geckos that I really, really wanted to work with the geckos that I really had a passion for. There's geckos out there that I certainly want to own at some point and to work with and try to breed. But my goals are, to really enjoy the hobby and to get as much out of it as I possibly can and learn as much as I possibly can. So when I got back into the hobby about, 2.5, 3 years ago, I went out and got the gold dust gecko, the day gecko, and I got Periodora andoriensis, a little tiny 2-inch gecko, curly tail, just beautiful babies. Went out and got Periodora, Stump. I got the geckos that I really, really liked and really wanted to work with. So that kind of was the goal that I wanted to achieve, was to go downstairs and really enjoy what I was doing, not go down and feel like I'm working. Now, having said that, we also have half of our collection probably crested geckos and gargoyle geckos, and I love them to death. But that's not, that's kind of the business end of things to some degree, and then all of these other exotic geckos are the passion and joy that I get out of the hobby. So my favorite geckos, I did a video on my top 10 geckos, I think, and I just named a couple of them. I like the small geckos. I don't like the really, bigger geckos. So probably my favorite gecko of all time is the gold dust gecko, which gets to be about 3 inches long and has beautiful blue markings around its eye. They're just a beautiful green color, but if you get it with the right light along its back, it looks like an ocean with the spangly gold shimmering off of its back. It's really a cool gecko, and it's small, 12 by 12 by 18 enclosure, little UVB light, and they eat crested gecko diet, and they don't really have a lot of requirements, really easy to breed, things like that. So that's probably my all-time favorite gecko. Again, love the crusteds, love the leopard geckos, love the genetics, but the gold dust is probably my favorite. Where I would want to go, where I would want to be in probably about 5 years, is not so much the expansion. I think I've pretty much taken up every available space that I have downstairs in the basement. I think I've used every inch that I possibly can. What I want to do is get to the point where maybe I work with a couple of geckos that I've always wanted to work with, at some point in the future. Right now, what I'm doing is whatever I sell, I'm going out and getting additional geckos to build up our stock. We have a few additional open tanks, and that's always a sin to have an open tank. So I have a couple of tanks that I have available for a couple of animals that I'll get eventually. Just it's a point right now of waiting until they're available and going out and getting them. But in 5 years, I want to be doing exactly what I'm doing right now, producing the videos, working with isopods, working with geckos.
What was this latest gecko you got? I can't remember that when you built all those tanks. They were very interesting.
I got 2 within the last week. One was a cat gecko, A. felinus. It's a real long, slender, slow-moving gecko, but very, very sensitive. I used to work with these in the past, but every time I would get a shipment in, unfortunately, if I got 3 or 4, 1 or 2 would make it, and 1 would always look bad. There were a lot of wild caught animals back, 10, 12, 15 years ago. Now, people are realizing what proper care techniques should be given to these animals. They can't take a lot of supplementation, RO water, and they can't be exposed to any heat. So I got a pair from a very reliable source a week ago, and they came in just as healthy as anything. So fingers crossed I can work with them and maybe produce some baby cat geckos. For me, the ultimate achievement to kind of confirm that I'm doing the things the right way is to ultimately get eggs and then hopefully get babies as well. And then the other gecko that I got in this last week was Nephurus meli. It's a little Australian gecko. It's called the barking gecko. Little brown gecko, spangles on its back, a spade-shaped tail. They're 3.5 inches at the most. Very handleable. Just the ultimate gecko. Just the cutest little big black eyes. Just the cutest little gecko. So whenever I'm working with an animal like that, especially the Nephurus meli that I've worked with again, years and years ago, and I wanted to get back into them, it's always, the anticipation of getting babies. And these babies from the meli, even though the adults are only like 3.5 inches, these babies come out looking just like mom and dad, but even cuter. So
that's I think that's the ultimate goal with anybody. When I get reptiles in, that's one thing I want to do. That way I know I'm doing everything right, is eggs and then offspring. And that's just like makes you feel like, wow, I did accomplish this, So that's definitely the goals that I do.
absolutely.
Yeah. Now your little geckos that you get there, the little morning geckos, they're small and they're very fast.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
think to myself, if that were to get out in my house, in my room down there, I would never find it again. It would be gone.
It's hard because, I think that the number one thing, and there's a lot of these micro geckos available, 2.5, 2 inches, and they're just beautiful. People in the chat, if anybody's seen the electric blues, Lygodactylus williamsi, the electric blue, they're just gorgeous, gorgeous animals. I had a cousin of that animal, but I had the wrong enclosure. I had them in a 10-gallon. I didn't have another tank available. 10-gallon with a screen top, which is, I don't know what I was thinking. But anyways, lift up the top and put the food in and cross my fingers that they didn't see me, and it worked really well for a long, long time. And I like different decor, and again, I'm a breeder, and I'm changing over the way I keep animals a little bit in the last year or so, more bioactive enclosures. But again, I'm a breeder, and I'm working with as many animals as comfortably as I can make them and as healthy as I can possibly keep them. But this was a 10-gallon, and I had a 2x2 as a ledge so that they could get on the 2x2 and then get closer to the light for UVB.
Mm-hmm.
And I had one sitting on one end of the 2x2 at the far end of the tank. I thought, I could do this. I can feed them. I can do this without that animal moving at all. And right when I started lifting up the tank, it looked right at me, and I couldn't stop myself. I continued to lift up the tank. It ran the length of, and this is before I could even blink, it ran the length of the 2x2, up the side of the tank, onto my arm, off my arm, onto my cart, off the cart, on the floor, and under the furnace. That quick. Now, I had thought that I had lost the animal, but within 2 days, with this tank of, they're actually Lygodactylus kimhowelli, and that was the male, the dominant male sitting up proud and showing off and running past my arm. But 2 days later, I went down to feed, and here he was right on top of the tank trying to get to the female. So, a quick deli cup capture and put him back in the tank, and all was good. But, like you said, they are just as fast as lightning. There's nothing, Andrew, there's nothing I could do about that. I couldn't close the tank fast enough. I blinked and it was gone.
Well, that's like the morning geckos. They don't even need a male to reproduce. So if they got out, and you're great conditions somewhere, then you could have a lot of them running around.
Maybe I need to do that. Maybe free range the morning geckos.
Yeah, I don't think your wife would like that.
No.
So, do you think this, like with the cancellation of Tinley, do you think that this COVID-19 is going to affect the hobby in any way? My thoughts are, this is just what I was thinking. You got all these people that had all these babies, like the ball python breeders. They had all these babies, and they were going to take them there and sell them. And now they couldn't take them to Tinley because a lot of people, most people take the stuff, and a lot of stuff don't come back with them because they make deals and all kinds of stuff. And then now they're breeding again because they were breeding before they even did that. Now they're going to have double the amount. Do you think it's going to affect the hobby in any way?
I absolutely do. And I think that that's going to be the biggest impact. There's going to be I think there's already impacts. Number one, I think that people are starting to realize that some food vendors aren't able to get their orders out on time. Again,
Mm-hmm.
I've talked to a couple of people, and one person lately said that they're on a 12-day, waiting time period. So I think that it's impacting food. And the other impact is people that came back from the reptile shows, people that can't do the reptile shows right now, they're realizing that their inventory is building up, and they're starting to make adjustments for the 2020 season and beyond. So they're pulling back some of their breeding projects. I hope they're, certainly, we've got a lot of great keepers in this hobby. So, snake breeders, gecko breeders, the chameleon. So hopefully everybody's kind of pulling back a little bit if they have stock available that they were planning to bring to a reptile show, couldn't bring to Tinley, couldn't bring to some of these other bigger reptile shows around the area. If they're in that situation, hopefully they're pulling back a little bit on some of their breeding projects and not pairing up and, working with their existing stock so that they can do online orders or, wait this period out and take their available reptiles maybe in a couple of months. If they're still continuing to breed, then they should be looking at other outlets to sell their animals,
Yeah.
Jump on Morph Market, jump on Fauna Classified, somewhere where they can sell, other than, obviously Facebook, somewhere where they can sell and start using these different outlets so that they can move their available inventory.
I think some of the bigger guys will probably be okay. It's the smaller people that are going to run into trouble because I know, a rat breeder, let's just say a rat breeder in general, right? Or even an insect breeder. You got a guy who's going to buy like 100 rats, $200 worth of rats. You got somebody who's going to buy $5,000 worth of rats. Whose order are you going to fill? You're going to fill the $5,000 order first.
Exactly.
And I think some of these younger people, the smaller groups, they're the ones that are going to run into problems more than the bigger guys. Because I know during I don't know if you remember this, but way back in the early 80s, there was a rat problem getting feeder in food. And I know it really devastated the hobby for a little while way back. And, because the only people they were filling were the bigger people. Because when AIDS came out, they bought up all the rats for AIDS research, and it just devastated for a couple of years. It was pretty tough.
There was a time about, if any of our listeners remember this, maybe you remember it, Andrew, but I think it was 6 or 7, maybe 8 years ago now, that crickets had that virus going around where the breeders literally were running out of stock, and you didn't really want to bring in crickets to your collections and feed off the crickets to your collections at the time because of that virus. I can't remember the name of the virus, but
I don't know, but I do remember hearing something about it.
Yeah, that was devastating to, people like myself with the geckos. Now, again, at that time I was doing the dubious, so it didn't impact me that much. It was just another food source that I had to eliminate out of, what we were feeding. But a lot of people that depended on these, getting crickets once a month, getting crickets once every 2 weeks, if they couldn't get their crickets and the animals had adjusted to just eating crickets, that was a huge problem for a lot of people.
It's I just hope that people do realize that they should slow down on the breeding at this point until this passes,
Yes.
because I think it would be definitely it'll impact the price of the animals in the long run, and all stuff like that. And unless, of course, you can hold them for a while and grow them up more, and then as they get bigger, sell adults or something. But a lot of people can't do that. I remember it was a pretty. Oh yeah, Juan remembers it. He said he was saying it on here. So
The cricket incident.
Yeah. So do you have any tips for people who want to get into like geckos? What would you recommend? What would be a good starter gecko for somebody?
Sure. There's a lot of different geckos that are real easy to manage, to get into. If you have that interest to get into geckos, I'd strongly suggest a leopard gecko. It really depends on if you want something that is more terrestrial. So let's say you have maybe a 20-gallon long sitting around and you have a lot of floor space on that tank. A leopard gecko is a perfect gecko. Another gecko that's really cool. It's really easy to work with. It's a fun gecko. I call them the prairie dogs of the gecko world because they're always curious and they're poking up their head, looking to see what's going on. They're part terrestrial, but part arboreal. They like to climb as well. That's the Periodora picta or pictus gecko, Madagascar ground gecko, ocellated gecko, a ton of different names. But Periodora pictus is a really easy gecko to work with. A lot of the day geckos are fairly easy to work with, but they're more arboreal. They like plant tanks. If you're looking at doing a bioactive enclosure, with a cleanup crew of isopods and springtails, dwarf whites, and you want to do the plants and make it look really nice. 29 gallon, even a 10 gallon. There's a lot of smaller geckos that are available, but the small day geckos are just a great addition to any collection, and again, easy to work with. They eat the crested gecko diet. You can feed them, insects, mealworms and crickets and dubias, but they'll take the crested gecko diet readily. They just need a heat source, and they need a UVB bulb, a light UVB bulb. But those are two geckos I highly recommend. And obviously, I think the easiest and one of the most handleable geckos is crested geckos. We've worked with crested geckos for probably about 18 years, and doing a lot of reptile shows, it's fairly easy to work with. I love working with families. I love working with kids and coming out from the table and bending down and letting the kids touch and hold the crested geckos. And, sometimes, and again, it's a difference between business and doing this as a hobbyist. I get the joy of having kids handle these animals. My biggest pleasure actually is to have a family walk up to the table and the kids, kind of, oh my gosh, look at the insects, the geckos, and have like a mom take that step back, like away from the table. It's kind of my clue to let the kids touch and hold the gecko, but eventually I'm going to get mom to hold this gecko too.
Yeah.
And once, the kids hold the gecko, the crested gecko, and mom holds the crested gecko, it's usually a fairly easy sell. And again, it's not all about selling the animals, but these crested geckos are so easy. No special lighting, no heat requirements. Room temperature is just perfect for them. They eat the Pangea or Rapace crested gecko diet. Easy to breed if you're into breeding. You don't have to. The only, limitation with crested geckos and a lot of reptiles is you can't have two males together. You can have a male and a female, a couple of females. You can have a male or a female. You just can't have two males together. But that's about it. They're almost disease-free. The other thing with crested geckos is that if you handle them a little bit too physically, they could drop their tail and they don't grow their tails back. But it's, a cute gecko with or without the tail. But, we sell a lot of crested geckos, but even more importantly, it's just such a mainstay in the hobby, and the colors that they get are just extreme at this point.
And to think back in the early 90s, they thought they were extinct. Isn't that?
Yes. Yes.
I was reading a story of a lady who had a whole bunch of, it was an article in a reptile magazine, and she had a whole room of crested geckos, and she had to get her roof fixed, and the contractor came out, and he was putting a barge board on, and he used a nail gun, and he shot the nail into the side, and she ran up and checked her geckos, and like half of them dropped their tails just from that boom, from the gun going off, from the thing, from the nail gun.
I always tell people, if you have a dog or cat, you just kind of want to introduce the gecko to that noise level so that they're not surprised. And, to be honest, Andrew, I've had thousands of crested geckos, and I can count on one hand the times that, now I don't have a dog barking next to a crested gecko tank. I don't have a garbage truck, in our basement, but I can count on one hand the times that I've literally seen a crested gecko drop their tail, and a couple of times it's just my not being patient with the animal, taking the animal out at night, and oh my gosh, look how fired up it is. Now I have to grab my camera and flash and take some pictures. Not the smartest move.
Well, one thing about crested geckos, though, even if they do lose their tail, they're still a fabulous looking animal.
They are, and you probably know this, but in the wild, you can't find a crested gecko that has a tail. They just don't.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Rose from Pumpkin Patch Exotics had a question. She wanted to know if you had any breeding tips on the white line geckos because she had a pair and she could never get them to breed.
Hi, Rose. Thanks for the question. What I would suggest is, really conditioning them up. Number one, feed them a good variety of a diet. They love, obviously, you probably know this, they love crickets. They'll just devour dubias if you can get a chance to feed dubias. Dust them, obviously, right supplementation. But I think one of the big tricks with them is to get them into a planted tank. Give them as many hiding places as you possibly can. And here's another little trick. If you can separate those two animals out, the male and the female, for a time period of a couple of weeks and then reintroduce at night. You've got a storm coming through. Yeah, it sounds weird, but if you have a storm coming through, introduce them at night, and that sometimes does the trick. But again, I think one of the keys is they have to feel comfortable. Give them a lot of plants, a lot of hiding places in the tank, and that's usually something that will start the breeding process.
Yeah, it's weird how the barometric pressure just from a storm coming through, even with fish and everything, how it really makes them reproduce.
I was thinking the same thing. If anybody, in the chat room is a fisherman or hunter, the movements deer start moving, at the start of a storm. Anybody can stay out on the water. I remember one time being out muskie fishing and the storm was coming through. I mean, it was coming hard. The black clouds are starting to roll over and we couldn't leave the lake. We couldn't, because we just knew. And sure enough, we caught a nice muskie. But I tell you, we got it in the boat, released it, and turned on the motor, and we couldn't get to shore fast enough. I mean, lightning was hitting all around us. We were just idiot young kids at the time. But the best time to fish is just before this big storm hits. So, fish movement, animal movements, animal behaviors all, kind of spike up at that time.
Gary Orner in here, I think I pronounced his name right.
Hey, Gary.
Is in the comments, and when we were talking about how COVID-19 could affect everything, he said that he's still getting his asking price for everything, and he's almost out of wholesale stuff, but there's no way he could produce 1,200 leopard geckos this year and sell them all. It just wouldn't happen, he said, I guess.
Yeah, I think it comes down to, I think you made a great point, Andrew, before. I mean, Gary's got a great name in the hobby. Everybody knows Gary. He's got some great animals. So there's a lot of factors there. But if you're talking about the smaller breeder, the breeder that's going to, has maybe a dozen breeding animals and they don't really have an outlet other than, local pet store and the reptile shows, and they don't have an online presence, they're going to suffer big time. Breeders like Gary and myself, we're in that process of scrambling around for other outlets and utilizing those other outlets. But I think a big part of that is that you have to have a big name like Gary does to be able to find, sources for those animals.
So, how many animals do you produce a year on average, if you don't mind me asking?
No, not at all. I'll go back because we're still restocking from a couple of years ago. We had a lot of great animals at that time. After I got back into the hobby and Annette had maintained the animals, we still had a lot of great animals, but last couple of years we're nowhere close to where we were, 5 years ago. 5 years ago, we produced, I would say probably, 300 leopard geckos, probably about 500 or 600 crested geckos, and then a plethora of other miscellaneous, probably 300, maybe 400 picta geckos. There was a great market back then for Periodor picta. So we produced a lot of those, and cave geckos and the small micro geckos, anything that I produced, from a micro gecko standpoint, they were being sold pretty regularly. But I don't know. So what's that? Maybe 1,000 animals a year, something like that.
So that's a lot, though. When you think, when other people are getting in there thinking, but when you say 1,000 animals, that's a lot. And things were going pretty good. And now, do you have anything you want to add or anything? And you want to give any kind of
Yeah, I guess it goes back to I think everything kind of circles back on a lot of points that we made tonight. Um, you can't keep producing animals that you don't have a passion for producing. You have to work with the animals that you really love to produce. Producing 1,000 animals was a strain, on us, especially with me working, 60, 70 hours a week. Nanette, with her daycare. Everything that we did at that time was part-time. It was Saturdays. Saturday full day was working downstairs. Sunday morning, full day. Nighttime, social media, feeding the animals. Nanette was helping. My wife was helping as much as she could, but that was a strain. And at a point where work even got to be more intense, and I was easily 80 hours a week at work. I couldn't keep up with anything, and certainly the animals took a back seat, and it really became not fun anymore. And like I said before, when I got back into the hobby, I went out and got the animals that I really, really loved keeping, and having the animals and watching the animals and seeing their behavior and researching the animals and seeing the babies and raising the babies is a huge passion. I've always said that the minute that I didn't open the incubator and see a baby and wasn't as excited with that baby as I was the very first baby that we produced, I would stop, working with geckos. And I still have that passion.
That's very good.
So, if you have the passion and, you keep pushing research, you keep learning. Everybody's learning. I've, again, been in it for 20 years, and I learned as much today as I did, 20 years ago. It's just working with people and understanding and keeping that open mind, but keep that passion, and that drives everything that you do, in my mind.
Gary Orner said, Wally is such an amazing person, the best of the best.
Gary, you're too kind, and I appreciate that, and you also are best of the best.
Do you find like social media, just not for your selling of your animals, but do you find social media impact your hobby in any way? Like, do you find it like sometimes you get like frustrated with like people asking you stuff and then you give them advice and then they do the opposite of what you say? Does that ever like make you not want to give advice anymore or anything like that? And then they want to know why something happened to their animal and they didn't listen to what you said.
Well, Andrew, that's never ever happened to me.
No.
It happens about, I would say once a week it happens. And there's a couple of people that come to mind where one of my biggest, everybody has their hot points. Everybody has their hot buttons. One of mine is to have somebody come to me and say, I know you work with Periodor picta. I have a pair and I want to breed them. How should I go about it? And then I, send them a message. And again, I've reached hundreds and hundreds of Periodor picta. And I'm not an expert by any means, but I know the basics of raising this animal and bringing it up. And I keep them over sand, and I give them cork bark, and I give them hides and water, and I feed them dubias. And so to have somebody come and say, hey, and I'll spend, 10, 15, 20, an hour talking to them, going back and forth and showing them videos that I've done, and then for them to go back and then come back to me the next day and say, well, I was on a Facebook group and they said that sand's bad, so I'm not going to keep them over sand. It's hard. It's hard from the point of it's fine if you don't want to keep them over sand, but to go off and ask other opinion, and that's fine too. But then to come back to me and not give me a reason why, other than somebody else said not to, that's where it's tricky. Some of the best relationships I have in this hobby are from people that I completely disagree with their methods on like 90% of what they talk about. But the important thing is that I'll listen to them and I'll try to pull something out of it. I go back to a story that I've told several times. There's a guy that I work with, at shows, and he raises we raise crested geckos, and he kept saying, you want to pull your males from your females all the time. Pull your males from the females in the fall. And I kept thinking, well, I don't, and it works out for me. And we got in, back and forth, and good conversation, productive conflict. I call it productive conflict. As long as you can keep an open mind, both parties, and back and forth. And he finally said, well, Wally, look at your females in the fall, or look at your males in the fall. The reason that you want to pull them is not so much for the safety and getting your females back healthy after a long breeding season. It's for your males. If you have your male with your female the whole breeding season, that male, all that he can think of that whole time is to eat, to poop, to sleep, and to breed. And sometimes he doesn't eat. And sometimes they focus on breeding alone. So pull your males away from your females. So there's that 10% of the time where, oh my gosh, you're right on. This great advice. So, you've got to keep that open mind all the time. So the hard part I think about social media now is that anybody that keeps an animal for any period of time and they've had some success with that animal, they're an expert, and they have the attitude that this is how I keep it. This is how you should be keeping your animal. One of the things I hate hearing, it's correct, but I hate hearing this, is don't keep leopard geckos over sand because they'll get impacted, and that's absolutely right. But it's right in the wrong way. It's not that they'll eat the sand and they become impacted. It's because they're looking for vitamins and calcium and minerals. They're looking anything that they can to get those supplements into their body. And of course, sand's one of the things they start looking, and they do get impacted. So if you have a food dish and you keep that food dish with calcium and minerals, it minimizes that potential for an impaction. I don't keep my leopards over sand, but they'll say they don't understand the whole process. They don't understand, the root cause, I guess. And that's kind of what's frustrating to me.
Gary says, productive conflict. He's stealing that comment from you.
I heard that Gary keeps his leopard geckos over sand. No, bad rumor.
That's like me with snakes. I've been doing it for 35 years, and then you get somebody who just jumps in the hobby, and then they ask you a question, and then you answer their question, and then they turn around and ask someone else, and then they try to make it sound like you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what?
And it's, even if they come back and say, it's not like they're confronting you and they're challenging you. Even if they come back and say, well, I'm going to go this way, it's still a little bit frustrating that they're not taking. And I tell people all the time, find mentors, find 2 or 3 or 4 people that you really, really look up to, and don't believe one person. Don't go down the path of one person knowing everything about everything. Find people and talk to them and get their opinions. Should I keep leopard geckos over sand? And no. But drill them and find out as much information as you possibly can. The good thing about the internet is you can find whatever information you want on the internet. The bad thing about the internet is that you can find whatever information you want to find on the internet, and you will find some sites saying it's okay to keep leopard geckos over sand. So keep the open mind, talk to multiple people, and then form your opinion of how the situation should play out.
Yeah.
One of the best sources that you could possibly have is, get these opinions, formulate your own ideas, but always think, in the back of your head, how does this work in nature? I was listening. Gary Orner has a great show, and he just had it on this last hour, and he made the comment about UVB bulbs, and I had made a comment on Facebook, and this is a direct result of another person, Ryan McVeigh from Madison area Herp Society, saying, you'll see a lot of times that people will say, well, this animal doesn't need UVB. You really shouldn't say that, because every animal is exposed to some, form of UVB. So better, it's better to say animals can benefit from the exposure of UVB lighting. So, you have to kind of use all of that and think about how this actually works in nature.
Well, see, now, not like with the snakes and stuff that I do, I find that if you research it, if you just do a little research on the area they come from, you could put a little thing together yourself and figure it out. And that's what I do. And I learned from a guy I worked for like 35 years ago, and his theory was always simple is better. You get all complicated and you start messing with things. Just go simple. Just learn a little bit about where they're from and try to reproduce that in your little enclosure, and everything should be fine.
Do they have wet and dry seasons?
Yeah.
Does it get cold at night? In Australia, some of these Australian geckos, even though we know that their warm spot should be 95, maybe pushing 100, just as long as they have another spot where they can get away from that heat, but they need that real high intense heat. How cold does it get at night?
Yeah.
So Australia, it's dropping. I mean, it's dropping big time. So there's got to be that temperature differential between daytime and nighttime temperatures. And sometimes, some animals like the Nephurus meali that I was mentioning before, they're pretty general, and they're all over Australia in the southern region. So they don't have as strict of a requirement as, some other Nephurus asper, as an example, would have that nighttime and daytime temperature requirement.
Yeah. See, and then it's just amazing. Like I think it was Gary up here said that Facebook. He calls them Facebook warriors. Facebook is bad for that. They really are. They really are. They're you get somebody on there, and there's just, even if they're wrong, if they think they were right at one time, they'll just push that issue until they're try to convince everybody they're right.
Do you use Facebook or Facebook groups or any of that, Andrew?
Just to show pictures. I don't really talk much in it, because I find if you see somebody asks a question, if you answer the question, a lot of times somebody will jump on and be like, no, don't listen to him, and I'm like, whatever. So I stopped answering questions on there. Yeah.
And you just get tired of it.
So
what's the? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
The other thing I tell people is, this is what I do. This works for me.
Yes.
And you just got to go with the way you do it, And then I tell them. So
everybody's house is different. Everybody keeps their animals different.
Yep.
I might feed every day. Somebody else might feed every other day, and that might be just fine, because they're feeding maybe more insects than I'm feeding. Everything's different. How can you? There is no, universal control of how to keep leopard geckos or crustids or whatever.
Yeah. What was that again? I missed that. I didn't quite catch that.
Everybody keeps the animals different. I might my humidity in my house might be different than your humidity in your house. So I might be spraying, my house might be super dry. I might be spraying 2 times a day, and then it dries out in between. You might try to spray 2 times a day, and it might stay wet in between, which is just as bad sometimes as the misting itself. So everybody's situation is different.
Well, I look at this. If you live in the desert Southwest, like down in Phoenix somewhere, it's going to be way different than somebody who lives up in the state of Washington.
Yes.
Totally different. So they got to take their own area into consideration when they do things. Does anybody
everything.
else? Does anybody else have any other questions or anything that they would like to ask Wally? Gary said people need to open up their minds, and I agree with that. And he also said that Facebook warriors are hardcore people.
In doing the YouTube, I think that some YouTubers that are sharing information are getting the bad reputation as being a pet tuber, and sharing because they have 2 leopard geckos, and they're sharing all of this information about how to care for leopard geckos, and they only have 2, and they've never gone through a breeding cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of hard too. I can put out a video and get 500 views on one of these micro geckos, and somebody else puts out a basic leopard gecko video and they get 2 million views. And as somebody working with YouTube and trying to get the information out there, sometimes that's a little bit frustrating, but it is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
I have a face made for radio, so I'm not going to get the views that
I say the
some
same
other
thing.
people are.
Although your channel's blown up this last year, it really has taken off, and that's amazing.
Thank you very much. It's fun. It's fun to see it growing from the standpoint that hopefully this information is getting out to more people, and hopefully people are keeping their animals better.
I'm not one of your viewers that you think you might have to get a restraining order against because I follow every. That was pretty good, that video you did.
I love sharing the information, but I also love kind of keeping it a little bit lighthearted as well. I hate putting out a video that's here's how to keep it, and here's a scientific name, and it occurs in the South Australian area, and so I try to make it a little bit fun. Sometimes I struggle creatively to come up with something funny, but we had a box unopening one day, and we had our granddaughter as the UPS delivery person, my wife, and we threw a blooper in at the back end of the video. We had her deliver, and then my wife gave her a $1 tip, and we got the box, and we unopened the box and everything. But in between there, the part that I cut out was me saying, well, Crystal, you can't keep that $1 tip. And she just went off on me. I can keep the $1 tip. You can't. So I added that as a blooper at the end.
That was funny. That sounds funny. Because I know, like with your last, when you did that giveaway, that was funny. How you categorized everybody, and then I got my stalkers answered on every video. I was like, holy cow! Oh,
I keep my eyes out for you guys.
But yeah, I would like to get Gary on one day. I think he would be a good guest to get on here maybe once, if he would ever think about coming on.
Gary has a wealth of knowledge.
Yes.
Absolutely. Not just I mean, Gary's known for his leopard gecko breeding, but he also has so much history in snakes, venomous snakes, now dart frogs, and all kinds of other animals.
Oh, that'll be cool. I'd have to get you on here, Gary, if you could ever come on once. Yeah. So anybody got any questions for Wally before we call it a night here? And Wally, I want to thank you for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me, Andrew. It's been a blast.
Even though,
a great show.
Even though we didn't get into the discus, because I know you used to do discus.
Oh, we could do a 3-hour show just on fish keeping. I'll go on YouTube and I'll see somebody bring up a video of Tanganyikan cichlids, and it's been 30 years, more than 30 years now. And before I even see them mention or hear the fish's name, I know what the fish is. Now, if I tried to come up with the name without the picture, but seeing the picture, it's like, oh, that's a xenotilapia. It's all still there somewhere, and I have such a fever to start an aquarium or 2 or 3 or 10 or 20.
See, that's the problem. You start one, and next thing you know, you got 30 of them going, and you're like, oh.
Well, tanks breed just as quick as the fish do. So if you have 2 tanks together, you're going to have 4.
4. That I have to agree with you on that one. I've been cutting back. I'm down to just a couple tanks now, so it gets to be a lot of work, especially with the discus, having to change the water every day. And
Discus, angelfish.
yep. So I want to thank you for coming on. I'll contact Gary over Facebook because obviously he loves Facebook.
Yeah.
And if there's anything you want to add before I go.
Well, I appreciate you inviting me for the show. You've got a great show here, and love joining you. Thanks.
I will. When this is over, I'm going to put the link to Wally's Supreme Gecko channel in the description so you guys can go check out his channel. He's got an amazing channel. You guys will love it. He does a lot of stuff with the family on there. I like it when you get your wife involved and and stuff like that. He's got a great channel. So I want to thank everybody for coming in here. And Wally, it was great to have you on. Tell your wife I said hello, and
Will do.
You guys stay safe with all this virus stuff going on out there, and we will be talking.
Thanks, Andrew. Take care, everyone.